Dr. Flew, gentlemen moderators, ladies and gentlemen, I'm certainly pleased to appear before you for my last full speech of this discussion. And I want to say at this time, while I have just a moment, that I certainly do so with high regard for Dr. Flew as a person. I wish him only well. Nothing that I've said in this discussion should ever be interpreted to be any attack upon him as a person. That what I'm saying is an attack upon his doctrine. But the doctrine, I must admit, is extremely weak. It is not only weak, it is false. Let us go through his speech as rapidly as possible so that I may then present another affirmative argument, as I have the responsibility to do, in some more detail than I gave it last evening. Dr. Flew begins by expressing the wish in this last speech that he were a professional biologist rather than a professional philosopher. And he based that upon the supposition that we're now involved in some sort of monkey trial. I have noticed that evolutionists seem to think that they rid themselves of responsibility for being rational about this problem by referring to the monkey trial. You see, when you say the monkey trial, you no longer have to give any more information. You don't have to give any logical arguments. You do not have to give any true premises. You just say, oh, the monkey trial. All of us scholarly people have already decided that. And anyone who disagrees with us is some sort of ignoramus. But I suggest that this simply is not a valid course of procedure. In the first place, to decide the origin of human beings is not, strictly speaking, a scientific problem. It is rather more in the realm of the function of Dr. Flew as a philosopher and a revelational problem. There is no single discipline within the various natural sciences that would claim that it and it alone can prove the theory of evolution. I want you to imagine here a series of circles above me, each one representing some natural science, such as biology, paleontology, biochemistry, physics, chemistry, so on, astronomy. Now, what do they do in their efforts to make some sort of effort at proving the theory of evolution? They draw alleged facts from each of these and then try to synthesize them. But now notice, the synthesis of scientific information is not the function of science, it is rather the function of philosophy. So Dr. Flew, you're just the man to do it. But he tells us he doesn't really know anything about it. But you see, his whole case depends upon it. How can a man claim to be an atheist, recognizing that if man is here by the creative act of God, then he cannot rightly be an atheist, and then come and confess that he doesn't know enough about atheism to even deal with the argument which I've given you, which was based clearly upon the impossibility of it being so. Now, Dr. Flew, it is not monkeys that are on trial here, it's atheism. Atheism and theism. And I suggest that a reference to a so-called monkey trial that occurred a few years ago in Tennessee is completely irrelevant, and it does not decide the issue. He says your God is too small. It proves only a God of power and intelligence. Well, thank you, Dr. Flew. At least we have come far enough for you to admit that there is one being transcendent of the universe who is powerful and intelligent. Now let us see chart number 22. Chart number 22. Dr. Flew, I have on this, and I'm going to leave it here for you to answer. In the first place, I have a drawing, an oval, and this is labeled God. Inside of it, I have this expression: supreme personal being, distinct from the world and creator of the world. Over to the right of that, I have true or false. I, A.G. and Flew, know that the God of this definition does not exist. Now you see, if he says he knows that God does not exist, then he admits that the God that I've proved by the arguments that I've given is sufficient. On the other hand, if he says, well, no, that's not true, I do not know that that God does not exist, then he admits that the God who was discussed in the discussion between Professor Copleston and Professor Russell, confessedly two of the world's supreme philosophers, was the very God which they discussed. At the beginning of that discussion, Professor Copleston said, I suggest as a definition of God that he is the supreme personal being distinct from the world and creator of the world? Is that definition acceptable to you? And Professor Russell said, yes, that definition is acceptable. Now I want to know, Dr. Flew, is it acceptable to you? Now if you say, oh no, that's not the God I'm talking about, and I would say that that God admits, I might admit that that God exists, but I want to deny that if you add omnibenevolence to it, that then he doesn't exist. Or I maybe want to admit that if you add omnibenevolence to it in the second place, that I would admit that God exists, but you have to add the last thing, that is omnipotence, and then I'll deny that he exists. Or if that won't do it, Dr. Flew, add another one, and then we'll see about it. Now I'm going to leave chart number 22 here, and I want you to tell us whether you believe that first God exists or not. Now let us note in chart number 44C, Dr. Flew, we're not talking about everything in the world we can know about God. I have proved that God, the supreme personal being distinct from the world and creator of the world, exists. And you came here to deny that. But I want to show in this chart, if you look at it turned on its side, I have over at the left in this circle man X. Now this man may learn about God by examining himself, as I have given you the clear proof. And what attention has Dr. Flew given to those arguments? Has he taken them up and declared the validity? Has he considered each and every premise and declared them true or false and shown you why? You know as well as I that he has not. But nevertheless, my arguments then stand clearly unassailed. His admissions on the first one, which amounts to the argument regarding evolution, made clear that it was impossible that man is here by evolution, by his own admissions. Now that makes clear that we are here not by evolution, and since we're here either by evolution or creation, then we are here by virtue of the miraculous creative action of the God who's described under that first category that I gave you a moment ago, the supreme personal being distinct from the world and creator of the world. Now, notice in the circle just above, as you follow the arrow up from man X to where it says man X himself, and then an arrow down into that inner circle that is dotted. Notice that I point out that you can learn some attributes of God from man himself. I have not said that you can learn everything about God from man himself, but I have said that you can learn some things about God, and you can learn that God is. Now, on the other hand, you have the Bible, and you can learn that God, that if the Bible possesses certain properties, then God does exist, that it is the book of God, and therefore God does exist. And note the arrow going to the larger circle, which not only includes all the attributes that you can learn from studying man himself, but other attributes as well. Now, Dr. Flew, if you would like to discuss in a similar situation for 4 evenings, each of us 2 nights in the affirmative, regarding the inspiration of the Bible, I am authorized to let you know that I would be pleased to come to England, to Reading University or somewhere nearby, to discuss the inspiration of the Bible, also in connection with the inspiration of the existence of God. Now, in this discussion, we are discussing the existence of God, but I should be very happy to go further into the matter of the existence or of the inspiration of the Bible. Now he comes to the matter of design and or the record of the rocks, and intimates that perhaps by the record of the rocks he's going to do something about evolution, after he's already confessed that he doesn't really know about evolution. But Dr. Flew, the so-called geologic column does not actually exist anywhere in the world, does it? That's something that has been conjured up by various evolutionists. Rocks do not prove evolution. As a matter of fact, I wrote letters to at least 50 men who signed a so-called evolutionist manifesto, asking them to send me the sound argument. That means a valid argument with true premises, the conclusion of which is, therefore I know that man evolved from some lower or non-human form of life. Not all of them answered, but not one of the ones that did, I think about 20 some odd, gave the sound argument. Not one of them, as a matter of fact, even gave an argument. Some of them rather facetiously said that they didn't need to answer it. Others said that they didn't bother with such simplistic formulations. Isn't that nice? I wrote to a man who said in the book of anthropology, of 8 chapters of which were devoted to evolution, that I said, I have read your book, I've read your chapter, crowded with statements, most of which I suppose may be true. But where is your argument? You know, Professor Max Black, and I want to know if Dr. Flew disagrees with this. I've quoted it several times. Dr. Max Black, who's a recognized authority in logic, said that 400 pages of crowded fact and argument may deceive the very elect. But reduced to a 3-line syllogism, as he quotes Josiah Stamp, lays bare the bones of the argument so that you can see whether the argument really proves what the speaker or writer claims that it does. Now, why do you suppose that these men who are posing as really the authorities, Dr. Flew, none of those men would help you if they were here. If you had all, I think there were 103 of them. If all 103 of them were here, there's not one of them that could write you a sound argument that proves that evolution's true. Now, you need to get on with it as a philosopher and do your job of synthesizing information from science and showing us why the theory of evolution is true. Now he comes to the human reproduction system and says that he's surprised that I brought it up. Why? He says human beings are born. Dr. Flew, would you like to shake hands with me on that? That human beings are born, but remember he said none of them are born of apes or of any other non-human thing. Now, what more of an admission of utter devastating defeat could a man make? Human beings are born, but they're not born of any non-human thing. That means the first pair had to start, as the Bible says, that God created the first man and the first woman, and all the rest then have come along according to the law of reproduction. Dr. Flew, I gave that for the exact reason that you fell into. You did just very nicely, as I had anticipated. Now the hands and the thigh bone and all of that, he has no trouble at all. He writes books and writes in journals and pleads with men to be rational. He writes in the Rationalist Annual, be rational. That means accept only such conclusions as that for which you have evidence. Dr. Flew, where did you ever see a human skeleton come into being by sheer chance? Where? Where did you ever know of anybody that did it? How did you ever know that anybody ever made an argument that could even make sense whatever that the human skeleton came into being by accident? When did you ever see a human respiratory system, without which we cannot live longer than 5 minutes, come into being by accident? But you see, all of these contrivances, such as microphones and so forth, he purports to tell us that there must be intelligence. There's got to be a mind that's intelligent, that can think and plan and design and has skill and can make it. But you see, things like these, the greatest vice in the world, the human finger and thumb, oh, that's just sheer accident. And if Dr. Flew, if it destroys you to say dead matter, I'll say non-living matter. Non-living matter, rocks and dirt, is still just rocks and dirt. But that's the ultimate creator, according to Anthony G. and Flew, of the complexity of the human being, with his soul, with his spirit, with his moral capacity, with his longing for God, with his recognition that he ought to do in certain ways and not do in certain ways, and he has admitted it. There is no atheist that can get around the fact that he has a conscience, and I know that God has given him that conscience. I want to spend a little more time in presenting what I have said already. I want to give a little more time to the discussion of the objectivity of moral law and what it proves, but I'm just going to have time to reiterate because I want this to be so clear. And here is the point that none of these men will be able to explain away. They may be able to go into their classes and somehow, by some clever statement, satisfy their students that they have explained, on the one hand, a recognition of objective moral law, and on the other hand, to hold to subjectivity. But before I get to that, let me say just a word. Dr. Flew spent a great deal of his time about religious experience. Did you hear me say anything about religious experience? Did I make any argument, thus and so, someone's had a religious experience and therefore God exists? I said nothing at all about that. Dr. Flew, I fight that as well as you do. There are people all over this country who claim, oh, a miracle occurred here and there. Well, let's see one. No, it happened over yonder. Somebody else knows how or where it happened. It's just like every evolutionist knows somebody else who knows how to prove it. Dr. Flew can't prove it. There was somebody over in some other university. Now, if you go over to that university, he'll point you to some other university. There's some learned man in Munich or Austria, or there's somebody in New Zealand or Australia, or there's somebody in California or Harvard that knows how to do it. But when you get there, they don't know how to do it. There's somebody in the last century. Darwin did it. Well, Darwin didn't think he did. Dr. Flew sometimes argues as if he thinks Darwin gave a deductive argument, but that won't stand. No, I didn't make the argument on religious experience, Dr. Flew. You're talking to the wrong crowd of people when you're talking about that. And I suggest that you stay with the affirmative arguments. I'm a complete loss to know why you ignore the arguments that I do make and invent other arguments and reply to them. It's sort of like Jones says, X is false. But Jones says, that's not right. Y is true. When there's no connection whatever between X and Y. Now let's look at chart number 43. I won't have time to get into this very much, but we'll get it before you and let it be perhaps the basic thing with which we will close in this main speech. In the Nuremberg trials, the Nazis were accused of high crimes. Their defense was that we have acted within the laws of our own society. Our society made its own laws based on our needs and desires. Did you hear anything tonight that sounded like that? Wasn't that the very argument that Dr. Flew made, that morality is based upon human needs and desires? That's the highest thing involved in it. Dr. Flew, the Nazis did that just as well as you did. Given your argument, there's not one ground upon which the world should have condemned the Nazis. And given your argument on people becoming senile or mad or extremely emotionally disturbed means they're no longer human, and therefore are subject to being regarded as nothing more than just meat, any more than a dog or a cat or a cow. And I submit to you again that he has joined the Nazis by his kind of answer to that question. They said our society commanded us to exterminate the Jews. It would have been wrong for us not to have obeyed. Now you try to condemn us by the law of an alien society. Namely, one of the nations was his and the other one was mine. But the prosecutor said, it is not simply the law of one land or one individual or even of a combination of laws of nations, but there is a higher law which rises above the provincial and the transient. Now notice, friends, if there is no higher law which rises above the provincial and the transient by which the conduct of individuals and or societies may be correctly judged as either morally right or wrong, then it is false to say that the Nazis actually did real wrong in murdering 6 million Jewish men and women. Now, on one occasion in this debate, he's tried to intimate, oh, sure, there's positive law. For instance, Professor Hans Kelsen of Austria. What's right is what any law, what any nation decides in its laws. If that's true, then you can't determine that you ought to punish one nation if they're obeying their own law. And even if two nations get together and decide that a law ought to go, that is not a basis for us to execute people. But those men were tried and convicted on the basis that there was a higher law. Not that they became theologians, but they were implying, they were recognizing that there is within man this conscience which can be only God-given, and that only a law above mere human law can be the basis for which such a decision is made. And when Dr. Flew admitted in one of the questions that there was no value on earth until human beings came into existence, he was joining the Nazis in holding that moral law is nothing but pure subjectivity. It is nothing but a function of the mind. And I declare to you that is one of the most monstrous, ungodly, satanic doctrines that was ever taught in all of the world. It is that kind of thinking that led to the Nazis. It's that kind of thinking that's leading to communism around the world. At the very heart and soul of communism is atheism. Dialectical materialism means that there is nothing but matter, and the dialectic means that the ongoing of the world has nothing whatever to do with the providence of God, but thesis and antithesis, which results in a synthesis, which simply means that there's fighting going on in the world. There's negativity going on in the world. There is this and that and the other opposing, and each one then results in a synthesis, and then we come on to something higher, and they're claiming that ultimately the whole world will be communist. And I submit that Dr. Flew is helping to lay the groundwork for it.
As it seems to me, but I know will not seem to others, I've met Dr. Warren's main arguments wearisomely often, so I shan't have any difficulty in meeting the rule about not introducing any new material. Now, Dr. Warren has many times expressed his surprise and distress that, having put my name to the proposition, I know that there's no God, I've not provided him and you with a clearly stated argument starting from some series of premises and eventually ending, therefore, there is no God, QED. I'm sorry that I've thus disappointed him and perhaps many others too. But I don't think I'm going to be in trouble with any federal or state regulatory agency on this account. For I don't think I've ever written or said anything which should have given rise to the kind of expectations which I've so obviously disappointed. After all, let me ask a question. How often and when you make a claim to know something or other, do you undertake or expect to be construed as undertaking to provide a supporting demonstration of the kind which Dr. Warren so vigorously and so often challenges me to provide? Certainly, when we claim to know anything, we do lay ourselves open to the challenge to provide some sort of sufficient reason to warrant that claim. But that sufficient reason can be of many kinds. And although it may sometimes include some deductive syllogistic moves, the only case I can think of offhand in which a syllogism is the be-all and end-all of the whole business is that of a proposition in pure mathematics. And clearly that's not the appropriate model in the present case. What I have, as you will know, tried to provide is not the deductive scheme which Dr. Warren wants, but what I think is the appropriate sort of sufficient reason to warrant, in this special case, the bold claim, I know. Maybe, though I now think not, this appropriate sort of sufficient reason is only enough to warrant the weaker claim, I don't actually know, but I'm acting just as I did. Just as if I did. But surely this is the appropriate sort of reason, notwithstanding that it's not the quasi-geometrical sort of reason which I think Dr. Warren wished and expected. Well, let's review once more what that supporting reason is. And the first step is a matter of method. And it consists in arguing that the right starting point is what I have indeed elsewhere called the Stratonicean presumption or the presumption of atheism. I actually didn't bring out these phrases from my books before into this debate, maybe out of that famous British reserve. But since Dr. Warren used them last night, I'd better explain what I used them to mean. My point is that all questions about the truth of Dr. Warren's system and all questions about the truth of any of the innumerable rival accounts of powers and purposes behind and above the universe should start with the presumption of atheism. And the presumption of atheism, like the presumption of innocence in the British common law, concerns the burden of proof. It's not an assumption that something is the case, it's a thesis about the burden of proof. It is the claim that, if we are rationally to proceed above and behind the universe to some story about the supernatural and the transcendent, then we need to have some positive good reason to believe in this story. If we're going to go behind and beyond what's common to all sensible people of any religion or of none, then we need some good reason for making whatever bold conjecture it is proposed that we should make. And it is, as I argued last night, important that we should all, in considering any particular supernaturalistic and transcendental system, bear in mind that this particular system has innumerable rivals. Remembering those early Christians denounced as atheists by their orthodox pagan contemporaries, we must recognize that everyone here is an atheist in respect to at least all but one of such rival religious systems. So I start, for the reasons given, from a presumption of atheism. This basic framework methodological principle dictates a certain orderly and progressive procedure. It requires that we start from the familiar and the undisputatious and proceed towards the less familiar and the more disputatious. I sometimes, following the good David Hume, call this presumption Stratonician. And though this is technically new material, I don't think anyone will object if I explain that Stratonician is the somewhat overstuffed adjective of Strato, and Strato of Lampsacus was next but one in succession to Aristotle as the president of the Lyceum. Aristotle founded the second university with money provided by his former pupil, Alexander the Great of Macedon, and he founded a new institution and made himself president of that new institution after and because he had been passed over in the competition to succeed Plato as president of the first university. That is technically new material, but it's not really a point of the argument. It just seems if we are going to say Stratonician, you might like to know why. Now, Strato of Lampsacus took it, as I do, that the universe itself is the ultimate explainer, and it and its laws must be the explainers in terms of which everything else which can be explained is explained. Right? Or perhaps I should say right on. The presumption of atheism is only an initial posture, a procedural directive. So what next? Well, the next thing is to consider suggested moves beyond and behind what is common to all sensible people of any religion or of none. Such suggested moves must themselves proceed in two successive stages. Stage one is the explanation and internal examination of the proposed system. Stage two is the search for reasons for thinking that the system proposed is a true representation of how things are. Now, stage one in examining any Christian scheme must again proceed in two successive stages. Stage one of these two stages of stage one centers on the challenge of evil. Now, where the particular variety of Christianity that one is considering includes a doctrine of hell, then the first suggestion is that this is flat inconsistent with the infinite goodness and infinite justice also attributed to the proposed God. Now, of course, there is more to be said in response to this first suggestion, though I don't think it's been said in these last 4 nights. There is more to be said, for it certainly will not do simply to insist that the hell-sustaining arrangements described must be just because the God who sustains them just is just, perhaps even by definition. After all, that won't do, for precisely what is in question is whether a being behaving in the way described can also and consistently be said to be just. Nor will it do to say, as has been said, that the critic has no business to judge God. For there really is no difference in this respect between me and Dr. Warren. To praise God as just is just as much to judge God as to say that a being behaving as described would be monstrously unjust. I don't stop grading at the point when, after a series of flunks, I award an A and congratulate the author on his fine work. Both the A's and the flunks are grading, judging, if you like. Now, the alternative move at this stage one of stage one is the right move when the version of Christianity is one rather less harsh than that of Dr. Warren. Now, the right move here consists in the suggestion that the infinite goodness and infinite power of God are together incompatible, not with one another, but with the familiar facts of an often cruel and wicked world. Again, of course, there's a lot more to be said. Indeed, in my first slot on Monday night, I began to sharpen one of the instruments which any such Christian has to employ in the attempt to meet this formidable objection. That necessary tool is the distinction between logical and factual impossibility. It is, after all, no use arguing in this context that the universe being as it is, it would be impossible to have certain good things without certain bad things. For, after all, the God whose credit is being maintained is supposed to be both omnipotent and good, and such a being clearly could and would have arranged the facts and the laws of the universe differently. Now, what such a somewhat less harsh Christian, confronted by this rather different challenge, has to argue is that all the admitted evils are the logically necessary preconditions of other and more than countervailing goods. It would, for instance, be self-contradictory to speak of a world in which there was forgiveness without there being injuries to be forgiven, or repentance without misdeeds to repent of. Well, that's the right sort of point to make, and then, having made that, you might try, an uphill task I'd have thought, but you might try to argue both that all the actual evils of the universe are in fact exploited in this way as occasions for goods which logically presuppose these evils, and that, it's important to note that second point, and that these higher order goods are abundantly worth it at the price. Namely, that it's much better to have had both the goods and the evils which they logically presuppose than to have had neither. You might, I suppose, reverting to the first alternative under stage one of this stage one, even try to argue that the eternal torment of the great majority of the damned is all sub specie aeternitatis, all made worthwhile by, and is perhaps somehow, even if rather indirectly, a logical precondition of the delights of the saved. You might, I suppose, try to do this, but it would be an ungrateful task, and the attempt to do anything of this sort would present a rather unlovely spectacle. I think here of what was in my day the unprinted, and in the spoken version, the unprintable motto of the Royal Air Force: "Damn you, Jack, I'm fireproof." Now, stage 2 of stage 1 of the systematic examination of any proposed system of transcendental belief raises the question of testability. In the good old days of Elijah the prophet, such systems seem to have been so construed that it was possible to make valid inferences to their consequences within this universe. And in those days, and of course still, if this situation arose, in those days, and of course still, any such testable consequences could be and should be tested, as the system of Baal, we are told, was tested and tested to destruction. But these good old days seem to be over. Nowadays, we are rebuked if we suggest any such straightforward tests. Perhaps we're rebuked with reference to the devil tempting Jesus in the wilderness. Well, fair enough, no doubt. But this security against the sorts of tests that might show a contention to be wrong is bought at a price. If a proposed system has no testable consequences within the universe, then it ipso facto says nothing about the universe. And I would have thought that it must be, in some sense, irrelevant to the universe about which it says nothing. Certainly, much more certainly, we shouldn't, I think, be impressed by a challenge to disprove a system, presumably as Elijah disproved the system of Baal, when that system is one which has been so safeguarded that it carries no testable consequences which are in any way testable. So much for the two stages of stage one. Now, stage two. Stage two is to offer and examine reasons for thinking that the system in question constitutes a true account of what it purports to describe. Now, in the last 3 evenings, 3 sorts of reasons have been offered by Dr. Warren. I offered another couple of sorts which I thought might be worth mentioning for want of anything better to do, and for some other reasons too. One is the argument which I'm glad to agree with Dr. Warren is altogether unsound about religious experience, and the other is the argument which is altogether improper because it's a different sort of reason, the argument of Pascal. Of course, I mentioned both these things because one could make in those connections distinctions that were relevant and were worthwhile. But the 3 sorts of argument we've considered have been the argument from the objectivity of value and the argument from, or I should say, to special creation. Since I've said something, or said it again already this evening, about the argument from the objectivity of value, and I've also said something with perhaps an un-British degree of vehemence about the argument to special creation, I shall make my last remarks about the argument to design. Now, under this heading, earlier on, I deployed a version tuned up by me of Hume's critique. And the crux of that critique, you will recall, was to notice that there are 2 peculiarities of the case of the universe as a whole which make it inept to apply to this case the sort of argument from experience which takes us from automobiles in Denton, Texas to manufacturers in Detroit, Michigan. One of these 2 crucial peculiarities is that the putative cause is by definition unique. The other is that the putative effect is likewise unique. The uniqueness of the putative cause makes it illegitimate to reach any conclusions, revelation apart, about how such a putative cause might reasonably be expected to behave. The uniqueness of both the putative cause and the putative effect together rule out all possibility of argument from experience. We have had and we could not have had or could not have experience of other universes and other causes of universes. That's so much for the argument to design. Approaching this critique of the argument to design from a rather different direction, I've also tried to show that it's no fault in atheist naturalism that it leaves unexplained the existence of the universe and the fact that the universe has whatever fundamental regularities it does have. Every system of explanation must leave some explainers unexplained. And this point is neither met nor changed by describing God as a self-existent being. To say it's a self-existent being, as far as I can see, is presumably to say that this notion is for you an explainer that is not itself to be explained, that it's improper to ask who made God. Well, fair enough, by all means say that, but don't think that you have explained the existence and nature of God by saying, oh, God is a self-existent being and therefore you mustn't ask what caused God. By saying God is a self-existent being, as far as I understand it, all that you've said is that there isn't any explanation and couldn't be of the existence of God. And maybe that's so, but it doesn't make any difference to the situation as between the atheist, who necessarily leaves some things unexplained, and the theist, who does. They differ here because the things which they leave unexplained are different things, not because one scandalously leaves certain things unexplained while the other's got everything wrapped up.
I'm afraid, Dr. Flew, you went 1 second over, so you don't have any to give back. In this minute and a half, I want to just give a summation of what has occurred in the discussion For 2 evenings, Dr. Flew was in the affirmative. I just want to remind you that there was not one single precisely stated argument made. Surely everyone can see by this time that while there are many things we can know, for instance, I know that I have 3 children. I don't have to set out a syllogism in order to know that I have 3 children. But there are many things that I do have to set out a syllogism. I have to reason about it correctly, or we simply couldn't know it. You cannot know as you read a 500-page book what it teaches without reasoning about it correctly, and I think really that Dr. Flew knows that as well as I do. He did not reply to the many negative arguments which I made when I was in the negative. He not only didn't give affirmative arguments, he did not really reply to very much of what I had to say when I presented negative argument after negative argument, showing that in order for him to actually establish his case as an atheist, in order for him to really know what the proposition is true, I know that God does not exist, these things he would have to know, such as that matter is eternal, that matter has always existed, that matter is the only thing that's ever existed, that matter is all that exists now, that life has come from matter, and all of that. He paid no attention to that. Now, when I was in the affirmative, I gave precisely stated propositions. I don't believe there's a philosopher in the world that wouldn't agree that that's the basic way to go about it, unless it is Dr. Flew. Time? All right.
This concludes the Warren Flew debate, Does God Exist?, brought to you by the Churches of Christ. We are committed to the existence of God and the restoration of pure New Testament Christianity. Any comments concerning this debate are welcome.